I gave up my career, my independence, my life, for a man I thought I knew. I learned silence, sacrifices, everything, just to love him. And then one day, everything I believed came crashing down. This is not a love story. This is a story about trust, betrayal, and the price of loving someone completely. Before I begin my story, a story of betrayal and how I one day chose myself, I ask you to support this channel. Please subscribe and hit the like button. It helps stories like this be heard. And write in the comments what city or country you are listening from. It always warms my spirit to see how many of us there are. And now enjoy the story. I never believed in love at first sight. Not really. I thought love was something practical, something that fit into your life quietly, like a favorite song you didn't notice until it played again. But then I met Julian. And suddenly, practicality didn't matter anymore. I remember the first time I saw him at the charity gala. He was standing near the grand piano, perfectly composed, a glass of wine in hand, the dim chandelier light catching his sharp jawline and dark, calculating eyes. The moment I looked at him, I felt a pull, a strange mixture of admiration and curiosity that I couldn't explain. What drew me in wasn't just his appearance or his wealth. No, it was the way he existed in the world differently. Julian didn't speak much, but he communicated in gestures, in expressions, in the silent weight of his gaze. I was told he was deaf. And hearing that, I didn't feel pity. I felt intrigued. How does someone like him navigate the world? How does someone so silent command attention without a single word? Over the next few months, I found myself drawn into his life. I learned American Sign Language almost obsessively. I rearranged my schedule, my priorities, even my apartment so that it could be Julian-proof. A home that welcomed his silence and comforted his quiet. My career, which had once been the centerpiece of my life, became secondary. Friends noticed my absence. My family worried about my growing devotion to someone I barely knew. But I didn't care. I believed I was loving someone worth every sacrifice. Julian was meticulous. He had rules, routines, a certain cold perfection that could have been intimidating if it weren't softened by rare, fleeting moments of vulnerability. Sometimes he would write little notes for me in perfect handwriting. Small things like, coffee tastes better at 7:15. Or the curtains are slightly off. Adjust. It was peculiar, controlling even, but I told myself it was because he cared, because he had to navigate a world differently than others. I fell into this rhythm. Every morning, I prepared breakfast exactly the way he liked it. Every evening, I sat with him in comfortable silence, watching him read or work, feeling strangely needed in a way I had never experienced before. There was a sense of purpose in serving someone so completely, and I mistook it for love. By the time we got married, I was entirely enmeshed in his world. The wedding was small, elegant, a reflection of his taste rather than mine. His mother, Helena, was present. A tall, icy woman with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. She observed me carefully, judging every expression, every subtle flicker of doubt in my demeanor. But I passed her tests, or so I thought. She never said much, but I could feel her scrutiny like a shadow. The first weeks of marriage were surreal. Living with Julian was like living in a painting. Everything was perfect, controlled, silent. I knew the walls of our home, the texture of his sheets, the exact angle at which he liked the blinds. I had traded spontaneity for predictability, chaos for silence. And at first, I didn't mind. I told myself it was love, and love required sacrifice. Then I found out I was pregnant. I should have been overjoyed, but instead, panic crept into my chest. The thought of bringing a child into this meticulously controlled world, this silence that I had been bending myself around, was terrifying. Julian, of course, was serene. He placed a hand over mine and smiled, a smile I had learned to read so well over months of silent study. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. He communicated perfectly with just that small gesture. And that's when the cracks began, subtle at first. A cancelled appointment here, a mysterious phone call there. Things that made me wonder if I truly understood him at all. The first night I questioned anything about him, I found myself sitting on our bed, staring at the walls, heart hammering, hands clammy. What if my life, everything I had sacrificed, wasn't based on the reality I believed? I tried to ignore it. I had to. There was no turning back. I was committed. To him, to the child, to the silent promises I had made. It was during a quiet Sunday morning, months into my pregnancy, that the first real test came. Julian had asked me to meet him at the study while he worked. I remember the way the sunlight fell through the blinds, the dust motes dancing lazily in the air, and my own reflection in the polished wood. I opened the door, expecting the usual calm, orderly room. Instead, I found Julian listening. He wasn't just listening. He was speaking into the phone. Not softly, not cautiously. He was laughing casually, entirely aware of every sound I had assumed he couldn't hear. For a moment, I froze. My mind couldn't process what I was seeing. Every gesture, every silent glance, every careful routine. It was a lie. A meticulously orchestrated lie. I stumbled backward, barely catching myself on the doorframe. Julian turned, smiling, thinking perhaps I was shocked by the mundane conversation, not by the revelation of my own life being a deception. I couldn't speak. I couldn't move. My entire world, every choice I had made, every sacrifice, every moment of love and care, I realized it had been built on a foundation of lies. He noticed my expression then, a flicker of recognition, perhaps even amusement. That's when I understood. This was a test. Not of him but of me. Every sacrifice, every act of devotion, it had been measured. And somewhere, in the corners of his mind, in the cold precision of Helena's judgment, they had been keeping score. I wanted to scream. I wanted to collapse. But I was 6 months pregnant. There was no escape from the life we had already created together. The baby, innocent and unaware, tied me to him in ways I could never undo. I sat on the floor, leaning against the study door, heart pounding, mind racing. The silence that had once comforted me now felt like a cage. I realized that love, or what I had believed was love, could be manipulated, measured, and controlled. And the betrayal, deep, cutting, intimate, was just beginning to sink in. I don't remember how long I sat there. Minutes. Maybe hours. All I knew was that the man I had married, the life I had built, the identity I had carved for myself as his devoted partner, it was all an illusion. And in that moment, I understood something fundamental. Nothing would ever be the same. The truth was no longer hidden. And neither could I hide from the choices I would have to make. I couldn't move. My body felt like lead. My mind a storm of disbelief. Julian, the man I had devoted everything to, the man I had learned to read without words, was not who I thought he was. And Helena, that cold, imperceptible presence behind every decision, every judgment, had orchestrated this. I wanted to scream. I wanted to storm out of the study and never look back. But the weight of my unborn child pressed down on me, grounding me in place. There was no running. Not now. Not ever. Julian finally noticed me fully, the expression on my face. His eyes, calm and calculating, met mine with an almost casual amusement. He set the phone down and signed slowly, deliberately, as if testing me. "You're upset." I could barely respond. My hands shook as I signed back. How long?" He shrugged, almost nonchalantly. "Months." The word hit me like a punch. Months. Months I had poured every ounce of love, patience, and devotion into a man who had been watching, judging, measuring me all along. I wanted to collapse, to cry, to rage. I wanted him to feel even a fraction of the betrayal that now consumed me. "Why?" I signed, my movements jerky, desperate. Julian didn't answer immediately. He watched me, the silence stretching, heavy and suffocating. Finally, he signed slowly, almost mockingly. "To see if you would love me for me. Not my money, my name, my comfort." My chest tightened. Every heartbeat felt like a betrayal of my own body. I had loved him. Truly. And it had been a lie, constructed carefully by him and that woman, Helena. I sank into a chair, my hands gripping the armrests so tightly my knuckles turned white. All of this for a test? I signed, my fingers trembling. He nodded once. Simple. Cold. Terrifying. The room felt smaller suddenly, the walls closing in. Every memory of the past 6 months, the quiet breakfasts, the meticulous routines, the nights spent in silence beside him, were now poisoned. Every moment of trust, every ounce of hope I had invested, had been a lie. I thought of Helena then. That subtle, sharp smile she wore at the wedding, the way she observed me, as if she were weighing me on a scale I couldn't see. She had engineered this. Every interaction, every little test, every carefully measured response. It had all been under her watchful eye. My mind raced. Did Julian even feel guilt? Was he capable of it? Or was he simply proud of the control he had exercised? I realized then that I didn't even know the man I had married. The man I had imagined loving was gone, replaced by someone I barely recognized. And yet, there was no denying a strange pull. The child in my womb, the life growing inside me, tethered me to him in ways I couldn't ignore. I hated it, hated him, hated the betrayal, but part of me was trapped in the consequences of choices made in ignorance. I left the study without a word, retreating to our bedroom. The silence of the house, once comforting, now pressed down on me with unbearable weight. I curled up on the bed, staring at the ceiling, willing myself to think clearly, to breathe, to feel something other than anger and despair. Helena appeared later that evening, gliding into the room with the precision of someone accustomed to command. She didn't speak, not at first. She merely regarded me, as if waiting for me to crumble completely under the revelation she had orchestrated. "You've seen now," she said finally, her voice measured, almost clinical. "You understand what we were testing." I looked at her, my mind buzzing with disbelief. Testing? My life, my love, my pregnancy? All of it. I signed, but my hands shook so violently I almost dropped my fingers to my lap. Helena's eyes didn't waver. "Yes. We wanted to know if you would love him without the comfort of wealth, status, or ease. If your devotion was genuine." I wanted to scream. I wanted to throw something, anything. But there was nothing in the room I could hurl that would even begin to match the violence I felt inside. I realized then that my entire sense of self had been undermined. Every choice I had made, every sacrifice, every act of love, built on deception. And the most terrifying part? Julian hadn't even tried to hide it. He had relied on my ignorance, my trust, my desire to believe in the man I loved. Days passed in a haze. I avoided Julian, avoided Helena, avoided the world. I couldn't eat, couldn't sleep properly. The pregnancy, which should have been a source of joy, became another reminder of my entrapment. Therapy was suggested, by my sister, by friends, by my own desperate need to survive emotionally. Dr. Claire Morrison became my lifeline, a neutral presence who could witness my pain without judgment. Sitting in her office, recounting every detail, I felt layers of despair peel away, exposing raw, trembling nerves I didn't know I possessed. "What he did, it's manipulation," Dr. Morrison said gently one afternoon. "It's not about you failing. It's about someone else choosing to test control. You need to reclaim your narrative." Her words resonated, but I felt the weight of reality pressing down again. Reclaiming my narrative wouldn't erase months of devotion spent on a lie. It wouldn't undo the sacrifices, the love, the trust one had given blindly. And yet, the thought of giving up entirely was impossible. One evening, I returned home and found Julian waiting silently in the living room. He didn't approach me. He merely watched, the same measured expression he always wore. I wanted to speak, to shout, to cry, but the only thing I could do was sit, motionless, my body tense with anticipation. He signed softly, almost cautiously. "I am listening." I stared at him. Listening. After everything, I wasn't sure I believed it. Could he truly hear now the weight of what he had done? Could he understand the consequences, the shattered trust, the fragile life inside me? I wanted to ask 1,000 questions, but only one came to my mind. Why? Julian's eyes met mine, unwavering, as if challenging me to demand an answer I might not survive hearing. And in that silent, suffocating moment, I realized something I hadn't before. The battle wasn't just about truth or deception. It was about control, about who would reclaim power in the aftermath of betrayal. I clenched my fists, feeling the first stirrings of resolve. The baby inside me moved, tiny and insistent, and I knew then that my life wasn't entirely his to manipulate. There was a force stronger than lies, stronger than manipulation. The instinct to protect, to survive, to reclaim myself. I rose from the couch, hands trembling, and faced him fully for the first time in months. Helena was watching from the doorway, her gaze sharp, calculating. But I was beginning to see clearly now, beyond their orchestrated illusions. The quiet between us stretched. A fragile, tense bridge connecting betrayal and the uncertain path ahead. I didn't know how long it would last. I didn't know if trust could ever be rebuilt. But I knew one thing. I would not let this deception define me. Not entirely. And as I stared at Julian, at the man who had shattered my life so completely, a new, unspoken challenge settled between us. Could honesty ever replace illusion? Only time would tell. Days blurred into nights, and nights into an endless echo of what-ifs. I moved through the house like a ghost, performing the motions I had once embraced with devotion. Preparing meals, tidying the rooms, adjusting the blinds, while my mind replayed the same scene over and over. Julian, laughing, speaking on the phone, listening all along. I hated him. I hated Helena. But I hated myself too for believing, for trusting, for sacrificing so completely. Every part of me screamed to flee, yet the child inside me anchored me in a web I could not escape. I began seeing Dr. Claire Morrison more frequently, desperate for someone who could make sense of this chaos. Therapy sessions became my lifeline, each one peeling back layers of fear, guilt, and confusion. You need to separate the betrayal from your identity, Dr. Morrison told me gently one afternoon. You are not the mistakes of your love. You are not the sacrifices you made in ignorance. Those were choices made from trust, and the manipulation is not your fault. I nodded, swallowing the bitter taste of reality. The words were comforting, but they didn't undo the storm raging inside me. I was still trapped in a house full of lies, with the man I had once loved silently watching, and Helena lurking like a shadow behind every door. Then came the first confrontation. Julian approached me one evening, careful, deliberate, as if testing the waters. He didn't speak at first, just stood there, hands folded, eyes searching mine. I want to explain, he signed. I laughed bitterly, though it came out as a dry rasp. Explain? After 6 months of lies, you want to explain? He paused, nodding slightly. Yes. So you understand. I wanted to slam the door in his face. I wanted to scream. But I didn't. Something in his calmness, something I had once mistaken for vulnerability, still held a strange power over me. You didn't just lie to me, I signed, fingers shaking. You stole my life. My choices. My trust. My love. You've ruined me. Julian's expression softened, though it didn't reach his eyes. I didn't ruin you, he signed slowly. I revealed a truth you didn't see. You had the choice to stay or leave. His words felt like a blade twisting in my chest. A truth I didn't see? A choice to leave? But could leaving undo the child growing inside me? Could leaving restore the months of devotion spent on someone who never deserved it? I didn't answer. I couldn't. The silence stretched, heavy and suffocating. Julian seemed to sense it because he took a small step back, as if giving me space to breathe, to process, to decide. Helena appeared then, gliding into the room with her usual air of calculated grace. Her presence was oppressive, a reminder of the world Julian had been born into. A world where manipulation and testing were considered lessons in morality. You need to see this from another perspective, she said softly, her voice smooth but icy. Julian's actions were meant to protect both of you from shallow attachments. You've proven you can love without convenience. That's rare. That's valuable. I stared at her, horrified. Valuable? My pain? My pregnancy? My life? That's what you call valuable. Helena's eyes didn't waver. Yes. Sometimes the greatest lessons come with the deepest wounds. I wanted to scream, to hit something, to shake the world until it made sense. But the child stirred inside me, and I swallowed my rage, letting it settle into a quiet, simmering fire. That night, I barely slept. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, feeling Julian's presence beside me, the weight of the child pressing down, and the shadow of Helena looming over every thought. I realized then that my life was no longer my own. Not entirely. But perhaps if I was clever, if I was patient, I could reclaim pieces of it. Slowly, methodically, deliberately. The next morning, I forced myself into the kitchen. I cooked breakfast silently, the motions automatic, my mind racing with plans I hadn't yet articulated. Julian appeared, sitting at the table with his usual poised calmness. He handed me a folded note, his signature gesture. I want to make this right. Please talk to me. I crumpled it in my hand, feeling a surge of anger and sorrow, and yet, the pull remained. The part of me that had loved him, blindly and entirely, was still there. That love, though betrayed, was stubborn. It refused to die easily. Days turned into weeks. I observed him, tested him, watched his actions with the wary scrutiny I had once reserved only for Helena. Each moment revealed subtle truths. He was capable of charm, but also cruelty. He was attentive, but calculating. And yet, somewhere in the depths of his silence, there was something real, something human, something that perhaps could be reached. One afternoon, as I was organizing the nursery, I found a photograph tucked behind a stack of books. It was Julian as a child, smiling brightly, unaware of the world's cruelty. And Helena, stern but protective, stood behind him. In that instant, I understood a fraction of the pattern. Julian's deception wasn't born solely of malice. It was part of a legacy, a twisted lesson passed down, a family code of testing loyalty and endurance. The realization didn't lessen my anger. It didn't heal the betrayal. But it gave me context, a thread, however thin, to begin understanding the forces that had trapped me in this elaborate web. That night, Julian approached me again. He didn't speak, didn't sign. He simply sat beside me, the tension between us palpable, a fragile bridge over the wreckage of trust. He reached for my hand, hesitated, and then let it hover in the air, waiting for permission to touch, to connect, to begin the impossible task of rebuilding something from the ruins he had created. I stared at him, unsure whether to pull away or grasp the hand of the man who had shattered me completely. And in that silent, tense moment, I realized that the next step, toward forgiveness, toward reclamation, toward survival, was mine alone to decide. A faint stir in my belly reminded me of the life dependent on my choices. My fists clenched. I would not let deception define my child, nor the part of me still capable of love. Somewhere deep in my chest, a seed of resolve was growing. Not love yet, not trust, not even forgiveness, but determination. And for the first time since discovering the truth, I felt the faintest glimmer of control returning to my life. Helena's shadow loomed, Julian's eyes followed, but I was beginning to see clearly. The battle lines were drawn, and this time, I would fight for myself. The days that followed were a careful dance of distance and observation. I stayed in my own rhythm, preparing meals, arranging the nursery, and pretending for the world's sake that life continued as usual. But inside, a storm raged. Every glance from Julian, every subtle movement, was a reminder that the man I had loved was capable of manipulating my entire existence. I began keeping a private journal, a place where my thoughts, fears, and strategies could exist without judgment or intrusion. Each entry became a small act of reclamation, a silent rebellion against the control that Julian and Helena had exerted over my life. Writing allowed me to separate my identity from the deception. It was the only thing I could truly call my own. Julian noticed the journal almost immediately. One evening, he found it sitting on the nightstand. I caught him staring at the cover before his eyes flicked toward mine. There was a flicker of curiosity there, a quiet assessment. He didn't touch it, didn't ask about it. He simply walked away, leaving me both relieved and wary. Helena, however, was another matter entirely. She never failed to remind me, subtly, that I was under scrutiny. Her visits became more frequent, her remarks sharper, though always veiled in polite concern. "You must understand," she said one afternoon, her tone syrupy but icy. "Julian's world is delicate. Every choice you make now has consequences beyond what you see." I wanted to scream. Every word from her mouth reminded me that my life had been a test all along. But I swallowed my fury. My focus had shifted. I wasn't here to argue or beg for validation. I was here to survive and reclaim control, for myself and the child growing inside me. As the pregnancy advanced, the physical weight of the child became impossible to ignore. Julian, despite everything, showed an odd tenderness. Small gestures, placing his hand lightly on my back, adjusting a pillow, ensuring I rested, were things I had never expected from him. They confused me, angered me, and at the same time, reminded me of the complicated bond that had formed before the lies came to light. One evening, I confronted him. I sat across from him at the dining table, the baby kicking lightly as if urging me forward. "Why did you do it?" I signed, the words sharp, deliberate. "Why orchestrate months of lies? Why betray me completely?" Julian's eyes softened, though not entirely. "To see the truth," he signed. "To understand what is real. You You have shown me something unexpected. Devotion. Strength. Choices made without convenience. It is rare. I wanted to hit him. I wanted to shake him until he felt even a fraction of the anguish he had caused. But I didn't. The fury simmered beneath the surface, contained for the sake of the child. Days later, I discovered another layer of deception. Helena had arranged meetings with family lawyers under the guise of planning for the future. Documents, wills, and financial statements, all designed to test my reaction, my loyalty, my patience. She believed that my choices could be measured, calculated, and judged. I spent hours reading, analyzing, and strategizing. I realized that to regain control, I couldn't simply react emotionally. I had to anticipate, plan, and assert myself deliberately. Every interaction with Julian, every word or gesture from Helena, became part of a larger puzzle I was determined to solve. One night, as I was organizing the nursery, Julian approached quietly. He didn't sign, didn't speak, simply sat beside me on the floor. The room smelled faintly of baby powder and linen, a small oasis of innocence amidst the chaos of betrayal. I want to understand you, he signed, eyes locked on mine. I want to make this right. I didn't respond immediately. My hands were occupied with folding tiny clothes, the repetitive motion grounding me. Finally, I signed back, deliberately slow. This isn't about making it right. This is about boundaries, about honesty, and about protecting what matters most. The rest, we will see. Julian's expression didn't change. He accepted it, silently, as if recognizing that the game had shifted. The balance of power was no longer entirely his. The first time I truly felt a spark of agency was when I organized the baby's room exactly the way I wanted, ignoring Julian's subtle preferences. I realized that control could be reclaimed not through confrontation, but through quiet, deliberate actions. Yet, despite the small victories, tension remained. Helena was never far, her presence a constant reminder that deception was part of her nature, and perhaps a trait Julian had inherited. Every visit, every word, every subtle gesture from them reminded me that trust would have to be rebuilt slowly, carefully, if at all. Then came the night that shifted everything again. I awoke to faint whispers in the hall. Julian and Helena, speaking in low tones, shadows flickering across the walls. I could only catch fragments, words like test, boundaries, reaction, and my blood ran cold. They were still strategizing, still manipulating, still measuring me. I realized then that reclaiming my life would not be a single act. It would be a long, deliberate process of asserting control, setting boundaries, and refusing to be manipulated further. The baby, my own instincts, and my newfound clarity would be my guides. I clenched my fists, feeling a surge of determination. The betrayal had left permanent scars, but it had also revealed my strength. Julian and Helena could attempt to control, to deceive, to manipulate, but they could not take my agency, not entirely. And as I lay back down that night, listening to the quiet, knowing the shadows of manipulation still lingered, I made a silent vow. I would survive. I would reclaim my life. And one day, I would define the terms of this family, this relationship, and my child's world. The battle had just begun. The house, once a sanctuary, now felt like a carefully constructed cage. Every corner, every hallway, every silent room reminded me of Julian's deception. The weight of betrayal pressed down on me, heavier than the months of pregnancy, heavier than the memories of love I had poured into someone who had never deserved it. I moved through the rooms mechanically, performing daily rituals that were meant to soothe him, to maintain the illusion of normalcy. Breakfast, lunch, dinner, each one measured, timed, prepared perfectly. And yet, I no longer felt the warmth I once associated with these acts. The joy of service had been replaced by strategy, by survival, by the faint glimmer of control I was beginning to reclaim. Julian watched me with his usual calm precision. His gaze, which had once felt intimate, now felt like an assessment, a subtle reminder of the control he had wielded over my life. I noticed the slight tension in his posture whenever I moved independently, whenever I asserted even the smallest preference. The unspoken war between us had begun. Helena was worse. Her presence was constant, her words carefully chosen to pierce through my resolve. "You must understand, Eleanor," she said one afternoon, her tone honeyed but sharp. "Julian is unconventional. He requires absolute trust, absolute devotion. You cannot waver now. Not with a child on the way. I wanted to laugh in her face, to tell her that trust cannot be demanded, it must be earned. But I kept my composure. I had learned that confrontation was dangerous in this house, especially when Helena was present. She thrived on control, on the subtle manipulation that made even the strongest person question their own judgment. Instead, I signed a quiet reply. I will not be manipulated further. Her eyes narrowed slightly, a flicker of surprise, or perhaps annoyance. She had underestimated me. And that small spark of victory gave me a renewed sense of purpose. The pregnancy progressed, and with it came new challenges. I was exhausted, emotionally frayed, and constantly alert. Every interaction with Julian and Helena felt like walking through a minefield. I never knew which word, which gesture, which small movement would trigger another layer of scrutiny, another subtle test. One evening, I discovered a hidden folder on Julian's laptop. It contained emails, carefully written notes, and schedules that revealed the depth of their planning. Each document was a blueprint for manipulation, a detailed record of my reactions, my sacrifices, my devotion. My stomach turned as I realized how meticulously they had measured every aspect of my life. I sat there, trembling, reading through pages that felt like accusations disguised as observations. Julian had been monitoring me, calculating my emotional responses, predicting my decisions. Helena had guided him, orchestrated it all, ensuring that my devotion could be tested, measured, and ultimately judged. I wanted to scream. I wanted to destroy everything in sight. But I didn't. The child inside me moved gently, and I felt a surge of protective instinct. This time, my fury was not blind. It was focused, deliberate, and sharp. I would not let them harm my child. I would not let them dictate my life any longer. The next morning, I confronted Julian. I had rehearsed my words, my movements, every sign carefully planned. I could feel the tension building as I approached him in the study. I know everything, I signed, voice steady, hands deliberate. Every note, every schedule, every plan. You and Helena have been orchestrating my life. And I will not allow it to continue. Julian's expression shifted slightly, a mixture of surprise and recognition. He nodded slowly, as if acknowledging that the game had changed. This is not just about you, he signed, calm but precise. It is about understanding, about seeing truth in devotion. You have proven more than expected. I felt my anger spike. You think this was about proving something? About testing me? I signed, fingers trembling. You manipulated my love, my trust, my life. And now you speak as if it was some experiment. He didn't respond immediately. The silence stretched, heavy and suffocating. Then he signed again. The truth is complicated. But I will not lie again. Helena appeared then, silently observing the confrontation. Her sharp eyes flicked between us, calculating, weighing, assessing. I felt the walls closing in. The house, the deception, the constant surveillance. Yet, beneath it all, a quiet determination began to grow within me. I realized that reclaiming my life would require more than words. It would require careful strategy, unwavering resolve, and a clear understanding of the subtle power dynamics at play. Julian and Helena had underestimated me. They had assumed my devotion was blind, my patience infinite. But I was learning, slowly, deliberately, how to navigate the minefield they had constructed. That night, I lay in bed, the child stirring gently inside me. I thought about the future, about the life I wanted to protect and build. Julian slept beside me, a silent presence, and Helena's shadow loomed in my mind. I knew the path ahead would be treacherous, filled with tests, manipulation, and challenges. But for the first time, I felt a glimmer of control. I would not be a passive participant in their game. I would reclaim my agency, protect my child, and rebuild a life on my own terms. And the first step had already begun. I had seen the truth, and now I knew that the walls they had built around me could be challenged, step by careful step. The days became a careful rhythm of observation and planning. Every action Julian took, every subtle glance from Helena, I catalogued silently in my mind. I was no longer a woman blindly devoted. I had become a strategist, a silent observer in a house built on deception. I started small. Subtle choices that asserted my control without confrontation. I rearranged the nursery exactly as I wanted, ignoring Julian's minor preferences. I decided what meals we ate, what furniture was placed where, what routines were followed. Each small victory reminded me that I could reclaim pieces of my life, one deliberate act at a time. Julian noticed, of course. He would watch me, curious, assessing. There was no anger in his eyes, only that same quiet calculation he always wore, as if trying to predict my next move. But he did not stop me. Perhaps he recognized that the balance of power had shifted, or perhaps he was simply intrigued by the challenge I had become. Helena, however, was relentless. Her visits became more pointed, her comments sharper. She questioned every decision, every movement I made. "You must understand, Eleanor," she said one afternoon while examining the nursery. "Julian has his methods. If you disrupt the rhythm, you risk everything, even your child's well-being." I forced a polite smile, signing slowly, "I am protecting what matters most. That includes our child. The rest will follow." Her eyes narrowed slightly, a flicker of surprise in her expression. She had underestimated me. That subtle realization gave me confidence. I was no longer the naive bride who had trusted blindly. I was calculating, deliberate, and determined. But the real challenge came one evening when Julian approached me in the living room. His hands were empty, his posture calm. "I want to talk," he signed. "We need rules, boundaries, structure. If we are to move forward, it must be fair." I studied him carefully. There was sincerity in his eyes, though layered with years of control and manipulation. This was the first genuine offer he had made since the truth was revealed. It was also the first opening I could exploit. I nodded slowly, signing, "Agreed. But the rules will be mine to define. And you will follow them without exceptions." Julian paused, as if weighing my words. Then he nodded, the smallest acknowledgement of a shift in authority. That night, I began writing a detailed plan. Boundaries for Julian. Boundaries for Helena. Rules that would protect me, protect the child, and establish control in a house that had once been ruled entirely by deception. I included every nuance, the ways Julian could interact with me, the ways Helena could visit, the ways I would reclaim my personal space. Every line was deliberate, every point calculated. The next day, I presented my plan. Julian took it quietly, reading each point with careful attention. His expression was unreadable, but I sensed the subtle tension in his jaw. Helena, standing behind him, studied my words with an intensity that made my skin prickle. "You are serious," she said finally, her voice cold but measured. "You intend to enforce these rules?" I met her gaze, steady, unwavering. "Yes. For my child, for myself, for the truth." She studied me for a long moment, then stepped back. That was a small victory. The first time either of them had truly acknowledged that I would no longer be passive. The following weeks tested the new boundaries I had established. Julian occasionally pushed, testing limits, signing softly, trying to gauge my patience. Helena probed, offering subtle criticism, trying to unsettle me. But each time, I held firm, responding calmly, deliberately, and without anger. I began to feel the first real sense of control since the revelation of Julian's deception. My anger had transformed into a focused resolve. Every interaction became a tool, every gesture a means to reclaim my autonomy. Yet, despite the progress, tension simmered beneath the surface. I knew Helena would not relent easily. Julian, too, was unpredictable. And the baby, a constant reminder of the stakes, made every choice heavier, every move more critical. One night, as I sat in the nursery, folding tiny clothes and organizing shelves, I realized something profound. I was no longer entirely at the mercy of deception. I had begun to reclaim my life, my voice, my agency. The first strike had been made, not in confrontation or anger, but in deliberate, calculated action. And as I placed the last blanket neatly in the crib, I understood that the battle for my life, my child, and my sanity had truly begun. The walls of control that Helena and Julian had built around me were not impenetrable. I had found the cracks, and I intended to widen them. The house felt different now, though the air was still thick with tension. Julian moved through it with the same calm precision, yet I could sense the subtle shift, the unspoken acknowledgement that I had claimed a portion of control. Helena, however, remained a constant shadow, her presence sharper, her words carefully calculated to unsettle me. I spent my days navigating this new reality, balancing the pregnancy, the house, and the fragile peace I had established. Every step, every gesture, every meal, every silence was a deliberate act of assertion. I had learned to communicate without words, not out of devotion anymore, but out of strategy. Yet trust, once fractured, cannot be mended with control alone. I found myself questioning every look, every movement, every sigh. Even Julian's rare moments of tenderness were now tainted by suspicion. Could I believe him when he smiled, when he placed a hand on my shoulder, when he adjusted a pillow? Or was it another test, another subtle manipulation? One evening, I discovered a hidden notebook tucked away in the living room. A journal of Julian's, detailing observations, reactions, and strategies. My heart pounded as I read, realizing the depth of surveillance, the meticulous attention paid to my every move. Every thought, every sacrifice, every moment of devotion had been catalogued, analyzed, measured. I wanted to throw it across the room, to tear it to pieces, to scream. But I didn't. I carefully returned it to its hiding place, the fury now tempered into cold, deliberate resolve. I would not give them the satisfaction of seeing me unravel. That night, Julian approached me quietly in the nursery. His hands hovered, as if unsure how to bridge the gap between us. "I want to rebuild," he signed, voice soft, eyes locked on mine. "But I understand. I must earn your trust." I stared at him, the words almost absurd in their simplicity. Trust could not be earned in silence or gestures. It could only be rebuilt in truth, in accountability, in unwavering honesty. I signed back carefully. Then start by speaking. By being truthful. By respecting boundaries. Every day. He nodded once, a faint tension in his jaw, as if acknowledging that the game had changed entirely. Helena, observing from a distance, tensed but said nothing. Over the following weeks, I tested Julian in subtle ways, presenting scenarios that required honesty, observation that demanded accountability. Each time he faltered, I noted it. Each time he succeeded, I allowed a cautious sense of relief to settle. Progress was measured in fragments, small victories against the weight of months of manipulation. Helena, meanwhile, attempted to undermine me subtly. Comments disguised as advice, criticisms veiled in concern, lingering glances meant to intimidate. But each time, I met her calmly, firmly asserting my decisions, my boundaries, my authority in my own home. One night, as I sat alone in the nursery, the baby moving gently within me, I realized the magnitude of what I had achieved. I had survived betrayal, reclaimed small portions of control, and begun the arduous process of rebuilding a fractured reality. The trust that had been broken would take time, and perhaps it would never fully return, but I was no longer a passive participant in the game Helena and Julian had orchestrated. The storm was far from over. Tensions simmered, manipulation lingered, and the balance of power remained delicate. But for the first time since the revelation, I felt the faintest glimmer of hope. Not in Julian, not in Helena, but in myself. And as I placed a hand gently on my belly, feeling the life growing inside me, I knew one truth. I would protect this child. I would protect myself. And I would not allow the lies of the past to dictate the future. The house was still a battlefield, the players still entrenched, but I had found my footing. The next move would be mine. The subtle tension in the house had grown almost tangible. Every glance, every movement, every whispered word between Julian and Helena felt like a test, a measurement of my resolve. But this time, I was no longer the naive woman who had walked blindly into a meticulously constructed lie. I was aware, alert, and ready. Pregnancy had changed everything. The child inside me was no longer just a life I carried. It was a source of strength, a reason to assert boundaries that neither Julian nor Helena could ignore. I began to move through the house with quiet confidence, establishing routines on my own terms. Small victories became my armor. I prepared meals when I wanted, arranged the nursery exactly as I saw fit, and made decisions about our lives that neither of them could override without resistance. Julian noticed. I could see it in the way his eyes followed me, the slight tightening of his jaw, the rare hesitation in his gestures. For the first time, he was confronted not with blind devotion, but with deliberate agency. He was testing me, yes, but now I could anticipate his moves. I had learned to read him as meticulously as he had once read me. Helena, however, remained a persistent challenge. Her presence was constant, her words like sharpened arrows disguised in silk. You must understand, she said one afternoon, watching me rearrange a shelf in the nursery. Control is delicate. You cannot afford to destabilize the balance you've inherited. I paused, meeting her gaze with steady eyes. I will determine the balance here. Not you. Not Julian. Me. She didn't respond immediately. Her silence was deliberate, a calculated pause meant to unsettle me. But I refused to yield. Her surprise, subtle, almost imperceptible, gave me confidence. I had learned to navigate their manipulations, to assert my autonomy without provoking open conflict. One evening, I found Julian waiting in the study, papers and notes spread before him. He did not speak at first, simply observing me as I entered. I want to propose something, he signed, his eyes steady but cautious. Rules. Transparency. Communication. If we are to move forward, this is necessary. I studied him carefully, sensing the weight of the moment. For the first time, I felt that he was acknowledging the consequences of his actions, that he understood the depth of my betrayal and my need for control. Agreed, I signed, deliberately slow. But these rules will be mine to enforce. You will follow them without exceptions. And Helena will respect them as well. Julian paused, then nodded. It was a small acknowledgement, but it felt monumental. The balance of power had shifted, even if only slightly, and I could feel the possibility of reclaiming my life grow. Yet, the subtle war was far from over. Helena's presence loomed like a shadow, her strategies and observations a constant reminder that the battle for autonomy would require vigilance, patience, and calculated action. Every day was a test, every interaction a measure of strength. That night, I lay in bed, hands resting on my belly, feeling the gentle movements of the life within me. I realized then that my strength was no longer solely about survival. It was about agency, about reclaiming control in a house built on deception. Julian and Helena could attempt to manipulate, to influence, to test, but they could not dictate my choices entirely. The house remained a battlefield, and the players entrenched. But I had found my footing, my voice, and my resolve. The next moves would be mine, and I was ready to reclaim every inch of my life with deliberate precision. The air in the house had changed in ways I could feel deep in my bones. It wasn't just the tension, thick and palpable like a storm before it breaks. It was the shift in the dynamics of power. Julian's gaze, which once carried the quiet, unshakable authority of someone who had orchestrated every detail of my life, now held a trace of hesitation. I noticed it in the way his hands lingered a second too long over a book before setting it down, in the slight pause before he responded to me, as though recalculating his strategy. Helena, of course, remained the constant shadow. Her presence, ever precise, ever unnerving, was like a silent predator, always observing, always waiting. She had mastered the art of subtle intimidation. Her words were barbed but delivered with the smoothness of silk. You must understand, Eleanor, she said one afternoon, her tone deceptively gentle as I arranged tiny clothes in the nursery. Julian's world is delicate. You cannot destabilize the balance he has created, not even unintentionally. Everything is interconnected. I paused, hands stilling on the soft fabrics I was folding. I looked at her steadily, my eyes unwavering. The balance in this house will be determined by me now. For the child. For myself. And for truth, I signed. She blinked, a tiny crack in her carefully maintained composure. Her mouth curved slightly, almost like a smirk, but I recognized it for what it was. A flicker of surprise. She had underestimated me. That subtle recognition, small as it was, strengthened something inside me. I had begun to reclaim myself, and they were beginning to notice. Days passed, and I became hyper-aware of the subtleties around me. I could anticipate Julian's movements, Helena's comments, the unspoken cues that once left me disoriented and anxious. I had started documenting everything. Not just observations, but patterns, tendencies, the timing of manipulations. Each note I made was a small act of resistance, a fragment of control carved back into my life. One evening, while tidying the living room, I stumbled across a hidden folder behind a row of bookshelves. My pulse quickened as I slid it out carefully, sensing that whatever lay inside could change the balance entirely. It was a collection of emails, meticulous notes, and documents, evidence of Julian and Helena's surveillance, recordings of my reactions, analyses of my behavior. Every decision, every emotional response, Every sacrifice I had made was catalogued, judged, measured. I felt a wave of anger rise, hot and sharp, but this time it was different. It was precise, focused, controlled. I was no longer the naive woman crushed by revelation. I was a strategist now. A mother in waiting. And this knowledge gave me the first real leverage I had since discovering their deception. That night, I confronted Julian in the study. My hands gripped the folder, fingers trembling with a combination of fury and determination. "You recorded everything," I signed, my voice trembling but steady. "Every reaction, every thought, every moment. Did you think I wouldn't notice?" His eyes met mine, calm and unreadable, but I caught the flicker of hesitation, something I had not seen before. His lips parted slightly as if to speak, then he signed slowly, deliberately. "It was necessary, to understand, to prepare." "Prepare for what?" I signed back, the movements of my hands sharp, deliberate. "To manipulate me? To control me? To test my love." Julian's gaze softened, the first real crack in his unshakable facade. "To understand devotion, to understand you," he signed, almost hesitantly. I wanted to scream. I wanted to throw the folder across the room. But I didn't. I set it down carefully, every movement deliberate, a subtle demonstration that I now controlled the intensity of the situation. The first true breach, the recognition that I had discovered their methods and would no longer be blind, had been made. Helena arrived shortly after, as though summoned by the energy of confrontation. She paused at the threshold, her eyes narrowing as they scanned the folder. The surprise was almost imperceptible, but it was there, a tiny misstep in her otherwise perfect composure. She realized I had found the breach. "You think this changes anything," she said, her voice low and controlled, but the tension behind it betrayed her. "You have only seen fragments. You cannot control the entire picture." I met her gaze unwaveringly, signing slowly, deliberately. "I control enough, and I will reclaim the rest, piece by piece." For the first time, I felt the weight of true power in my hands. The house remained a battlefield, yes, and the players, Julian and Helena, were still formidable, still calculating, still dangerous. But I had breached their defenses. I had found the weak point, and now the momentum was shifting. Over the next few days, I began to act deliberately, carefully testing the boundaries I had now discovered. Julian's movements were subtle, his small acts of manipulation slightly misaligned, revealing cracks I could exploit. Helena's commentary became less certain, her gaze sharper but tinged with caution. I realized they were both aware that the balance of control had shifted, and that fear, subtle but real, could be felt in their calculated actions. One evening, I sat in the nursery, my hands resting on my belly as the baby stirred softly inside me. The sense of agency I felt now was intoxicating. For months, I had been a victim of deception and manipulation, my trust weaponized against me. But now, with knowledge in my hands and careful observation of their behaviors, I had begun to rewrite the rules of this house. The first breach had been made. Julian's calm, measured authority had met its first real challenge. Helena's relentless scrutiny had encountered resistance. I had found the cracks, and for the first time, I knew that I could widen them. I exhaled slowly, feeling the power of choice settle into my chest. The battle was far from over. Manipulation, deceit, and control still lingered like shadows, but I had stepped into the light of awareness. I would not be passive. I would not be silenced. I would reclaim the pieces of my life stolen from me, and I would protect the life growing inside me. And as the baby kicked gently beneath my hand, I understood one undeniable truth. I was no longer the same Eleanor who had walked blindly into this house. I was a strategist, a mother, a woman reclaiming her agency. The first breach had been made, and nothing, not Julian, not Helena, nor the ghosts of the past, would ever be the same again. The house no longer felt like a home. It was a battlefield, every room a front line, every hallway a corridor of tension. Julian moved with his usual calculated precision, yet now there was a hesitation, a subtle second thought before he acted. I noticed it in the flicker of his eyes, the slight pause before signing, the way his hands lingered in the air a fraction longer than necessary. He was aware. He knew I had discovered the first breach. Helena, on the other hand, remained the constant, looming presence. Her footsteps, soft and measured, echoed through the halls like a reminder that she had always been watching, always calculating. But even she, the orchestrator of subtle terror and psychological tests, was beginning to show cracks. There was a faint tightness around her jawline, a rare hesitation in her voice, a flicker of doubt in her otherwise unshakable demeanor. I had begun documenting everything. Observations, patterns, behaviors, all carefully noted, all silently stored. Each document, each note, each observation was a tool I could use to regain control. I was no longer simply reacting. I was strategizing, planning, and anticipating their moves. My fury had transformed into something precise and calculated. One morning, I approached Julian in the study, folder in hand, containing my observations from the last few weeks. I set it gently on the desk, my hands steady, my gaze unwavering. "I've documented everything," I signed. "Your patterns. Helena's patterns. Your reactions. Every subtle manipulation. And I've noticed the cracks." Julian's eyes flickered, a brief moment of tension crossing his otherwise controlled features. He signed back slowly, deliberately. "Cracks? You think you've seen them all?" "I've seen enough," I replied, fingers trembling slightly with controlled anger. "And I intend to widen them, piece by piece, until the balance of control shifts entirely." He paused, studying me, a mixture of curiosity and caution in his gaze. There was no fear, no anger, only the realization that his careful game was being challenged. Helena arrived later, her steps silent but deliberate. She stood in the doorway, her eyes scanning the folder. That small flicker of surprise she displayed, barely perceptible, was a victory. She had underestimated me. "You think this changes anything," she said, her tone smooth, yet the underlying tension was evident. "You've only begun to see fragments. You cannot control the full picture." I met her gaze, calm and unyielding. "I control enough. And I will reclaim the rest." The first real test came the following day. Helena, determined to assert her influence, tried to undermine me subtly. She questioned my choices, commented on my arrangements, and suggested changes under the guise of concern. But this time I was ready. "Thank you for your input," I signed calmly. "But the decisions in this house, especially regarding the child, are mine. I've observed patterns. I've documented behaviors. I will not be manipulated further." Helena's eyes narrowed, but I held my ground. I saw Julian watching quietly from the corner, his expression unreadable but tense. The balance of power had begun to shift, however slowly. That night, I sat alone in the nursery, folding tiny clothes, organizing shelves, and reflecting on the changes that had occurred. For months, I had been a victim of deception, my trust weaponized against me, my life carefully measured and judged. But now, armed with knowledge and deliberate strategy, I had breached the first lines of control. I could feel the shift in the air, the subtle tension, the hesitation, the cracks forming in the facades of those who had once dominated me. The baby moved gently within me, a soft reminder of why this battle mattered. I could not allow deceit and manipulation to dictate the life of my child or my own. The determination that had been growing quietly within me now burned brightly. I would not be passive. I would reclaim my agency. I would protect what was mine. Over the next few days, I implemented small, deliberate actions to test boundaries and assert control. I reorganized schedules, made decisions about meals and routines without consulting Julian, and subtly redirected Helena's attempts at influence. Each action was measured, calculated, and precise. I was no longer reacting out of emotion. I was strategizing, predicting, and acting with purpose. Julian's response was subtle. He did not confront me openly, but I could feel the tension in his posture, the careful calculation in his movements. He was aware that the dynamics had changed. Helena, meanwhile, became more restrained, her attempts at manipulation less frequent and more cautious. One evening, I discovered another folder hidden in the study. Emails, notes, and observations I had not seen before. Julian and Helena had been monitoring my interactions, documenting my emotional responses, and analyzing every subtle movement. I felt a surge of anger, but it was tempered with determination. I was no longer powerless. I had discovered the pattern, and now I could anticipate their moves. Confronting Julian again, I laid out the contents of the folder. "I've seen everything," I signed. "Every note, every plan, every strategy. You thought you could control me completely, But I've learned, observed, and planned. The game has changed. He looked at me, eyes flickering with something I could not name. Perhaps curiosity, perhaps unease. He signed back slowly. The game is changing. But so are you. Are you prepared for what comes next? I met his gaze, unwavering. I am ready. I will not be deceived again. I will not be controlled again. And I will protect what matters most, my child and myself. That night, as I lay in the nursery, the baby stirring gently inside me, I realized the magnitude of what I had accomplished. The first true breach in their carefully constructed world had been made. I had discovered their methods, anticipated their moves, and begun to reclaim control over my life. The house remained a battlefield. Julian and Helena were still formidable, still calculating, still capable of manipulation. But I had stepped into a position of power. The first breach had been made. The next moves were mine to orchestrate. And as the baby kicked softly, I understood one undeniable truth. I would not be a passive participant in the web they had spun. I would fight, quietly, deliberately, and without hesitation. The reckoning had begun, and nothing would ever be the same again. The days blurred together, a mix of calculated routines, subtle confrontations, and quiet observations. The pregnancy weighed on me physically, but emotionally, I had never felt more alert, more aware. Every glance, every movement, every hushed word in the house became data. Pieces of a puzzle I was slowly piecing together. Julian's calm, measured demeanor was still intact, but I could sense the hesitation now, the split-second pauses where he recalculated his next move. Helena was harder to read. She maintained her polished composure, but her sharp eyes missed nothing, and I could feel the subtle undercurrents of judgment and evaluation aimed squarely at me. Her comments, though always polite, carried an unmistakable edge. "You have become assertive," she said one afternoon, her voice smooth but cool. "I suppose that is to be expected. You have no choice but to adapt." I met her gaze steadily, signing deliberately. "I have a choice. And I choose my boundaries. I choose the truth. And I choose to protect my child and myself." Her expression flickered. A subtle, almost imperceptible sign that she had not anticipated the depth of my resolve. That moment, small as it was, strengthened something within me. I realized then that the next phase of reclaiming my life could not rely solely on observation or small victories. I needed action. Deliberate, undeniable, irreversible action. The first breach had been made in Part 9, but now it was time to widen it, to ensure that the balance of control shifted firmly in my favor. I began implementing changes in the house, routine decisions, minor adjustments, and strategic disruptions designed to challenge Julian and Helena without overt confrontation. The nursery schedule, the meals, even the seemingly trivial arrangements of furniture, all became tools to assert my agency. Julian noticed. His eyes often followed me longer than necessary, his gestures slightly delayed as he calculated my intentions. But he did not confront me openly. Instead, he observed, tested, and measured. For the first time, I realized that the subtle tension between us had shifted. I had entered his sphere as an equal, a strategist capable of challenging his meticulous control. Helena, however, was relentless. Her interventions became more frequent, her comments more pointed. She would watch, critique, and subtly attempt to undermine my decisions. But each time, I met her with calm, deliberate responses, reinforcing my authority in the house. One evening, I found Julian in the study, papers spread before him as if preparing for a battle. I entered cautiously, observing him, noting the tension in his posture, the slight narrowing of his eyes. "We need rules," he signed, finally breaking the silence. "Boundaries. Transparency. Communication. To move forward, it must be fair." I studied him carefully. The sincerity in his eyes was tempered by the lingering remnants of control. "Agreed," I signed slowly, deliberately. "But these rules will be mine to enforce. You and Helena will follow them without exception." Julian paused, then nodded, acknowledging the shift. Helena arrived shortly after, her presence immediately imposing, yet I sensed hesitation beneath her composed exterior. The cracks were widening. The first real test came unexpectedly. Helena attempted to subtly manipulate a decision regarding the nursery layout, presenting it as concern for the child's comfort. I observed carefully, signing deliberately. The arrangements here reflect my choices, my planning. I will not be manipulated. Her sharp gaze flickered. Julian too was watching, and I could feel the tension in his posture. My subtle assertion of control had landed, and it had landed hard. In the following days, I continued implementing strategic changes, observing every reaction. Julian tested me subtly, questioning minor decisions, gauging my patience, while Helena probed for weaknesses, looking for the slightest misstep. Each time, I held firm, responding with calm, deliberate action. My anger had transformed into precise strategy, my fury into controlled determination. One night, as I sat in the nursery, my hand resting on my belly, I reflected on the journey so far. The betrayal, the lies, the manipulation. It had all been a storm that threatened to consume me. Yet here I was, standing firmly, reclaiming my life, asserting boundaries, and protecting the life within me. I realized then that the tipping point had arrived. The first breaches had been made. The small cracks had become undeniable. Julian and Helena could no longer manipulate or control me with impunity. The balance of power had shifted, and I was determined to consolidate it fully. The following day, I implemented my most deliberate action yet. I presented a comprehensive plan for the household. Schedules, boundaries, routines, and clear rules for interactions. Julian read it quietly, expression unreadable, yet I felt the subtle tension in his jaw, the slight flicker in his eyes. Helena, observing from the doorway, was momentarily speechless. "You are precise," Julian signed finally, a mixture of acknowledgement and caution in his tone. "You have changed. You have grown stronger than I anticipated." I met his gaze, signing deliberately. "Strength comes from necessity. From survival. And I will not be controlled again." Helena finally spoke, her voice smooth but tight. "You think you have achieved balance. But you have only begun. The real challenges lie ahead." I nodded subtly, a quiet determination settling in my chest. "Then I am ready. I will face them. And I will protect my child and myself, no matter what it takes." That night, as I lay in bed, feeling the gentle movements of my baby, I understood the magnitude of the journey ahead. The tipping point had arrived, the first true shift in power had been made, and the next moves were mine. The house was still a battlefield, but for the first time, I felt a sense of control. Julian and Helena were formidable, yes, but their strategies had cracks. Their carefully orchestrated plans were no longer invincible, and I had learned to navigate, to anticipate, and to strike with deliberate precision. The tipping point had been reached. The first breach had become a foundation, and I was ready to expand it, to reclaim every inch of my life, and to ensure that deception and manipulation could no longer dictate the course of my world. The reckoning had begun, and I would see it through, relentless, deliberate, and unwavering. The air in the house was thick with tension, denser than I had ever felt it before. Every room, every hallway, every corner carried the weight of months of manipulation, deception, and calculated surveillance. Julian moved with his usual calm, precise demeanor, yet I could sense the shift, the hesitation, the slight falter in his movements, the quiet acknowledgement that his authority had been challenged and in many ways, broken. Helena, ever the shadow that lingered at the edge of every moment, had begun to unravel in subtle ways. Her steps, once soft and deliberate, now carried the faintest edge of impatience. Her polished voice, always measured, occasionally betrayed tension. I watched her closely, noting every micro-expression, every subtle twitch, every hesitation. The pregnancy had made me stronger in ways I had not anticipated. My focus sharpened, my awareness heightened. Every glance, every word, every movement in the house became data, a piece of the puzzle I was slowly assembling, a blueprint for reclaiming the life that had been stolen from me. It had all led to this, the final confrontation. I called Julian to the study, folder in hand, containing all my observations, notes, and carefully documented breaches of control. Helena hovered near the doorway, her gaze sharp and assessing, but I ignored her. This was between Julian and me. "I've seen everything," I signed, my hands deliberate, my eyes unwavering. "Every note, every plan, every manipulation. I know how you and Helena orchestrated my life. And I know how to reclaim it." Julian's calm gaze met mine, and for the first time, I saw genuine tension flicker in his eyes. "Reclaim it? You have no idea what you are asking," he signed slowly. I stepped closer, voice steady, hands firm. I am asking nothing. I am stating. The rules in this house will be mine to enforce. You and Helena will follow them without exception. This ends now. Helena's lips pressed into a thin line, but she said nothing. Julian paused, studying me, then nodded slowly. It was an acknowledgement of the shift. The balance had changed, and he could no longer dominate the narrative of my life. Over the next few hours, we walked through every aspect of the household. Boundaries were established and enforced. Julian agreed to daily transparency, to honest communication, and to respecting limits I had set months ago. Helena, surprisingly, did not resist openly. She accepted the rules quietly, though her eyes betrayed her frustration. I realized then that control, once observed and strategically challenged, could not remain entirely in the hands of manipulators. The house, which had felt like a cage for so long, began to feel like a place where I could breathe. Not entirely free, not entirely safe, but a place where boundaries existed and were respected. For the first time since discovering the truth about Julian's deception, I felt a fragile sense of agency. Yet the betrayal could not be undone. Trust, once fractured, cannot be restored fully. The months of manipulation, the false pretenses, the emotional and psychological toll, it all remained, lingering beneath the surface. Julian's apology, sincere though it may have been, could not erase the past. But it marked the beginning of accountability, the foundation for something new, built on honesty rather than illusion. I spent that night in the nursery, hands resting on my belly, feeling the gentle movements of the child growing within me. I thought about the journey, about the betrayal, the lies, the manipulation, and the small victories that had allowed me to reclaim pieces of my life. I realized that this child represented more than life itself. It symbolized resilience, strength, and the possibility of creating a future shaped by truth rather than deception. In the days that followed, I began therapy. Long, grueling sessions where I confronted the emotional toll of Julian's deception, the loneliness that had pushed me into dependency, and the fear and confusion that had dominated my thoughts. The process was painful, but necessary. I learned to separate my identity from the lies I had been forced to endure, to reclaim my voice, my confidence, and my agency. Julian participated reluctantly at first, but eventually, he understood the importance of transparency, accountability, and respect. Our interactions became grounded in honesty, though the trust that had once existed would never fully return. Helena's presence diminished gradually, her interventions no longer constant, her influence contained by the boundaries I had set. Years later, as I reflected on the journey, I realized that the pain never truly disappeared. The scars of betrayal remained, etched into memory and experience. But they also became markers of resilience, reminders that survival, agency, and integrity could emerge even from manipulation and deceit. I had walked through the fire, endured the storm, and emerged with my identity intact. The child I had carried became a symbol of strength and continuity, a life untainted by deception. Julian and I existed in a new dynamic, not lovers bound by illusion, but co-parents navigating a complex truth, accountable to each other in ways that had been impossible before. The house, once a cage of manipulation, now carried the possibility of honesty, boundaries, and deliberate choice. It was imperfect, fractured, and fraught with the echoes of the past, but it was mine. And for the first time in years, I felt a profound sense of agency, of control, and of peace. The reckoning had ended, but the journey continued. And I was no longer the same Eleanor who had walked blindly into deception. I was stronger, wiser, and ready to shape the life of myself and my child on my own terms. The dawn had arrived, and with it, the possibility of a life built not on illusion, but on truth. If this story touched your heart or taught you something valuable, make sure to like, share, and subscribe for more inspiring stories.